Hello and welcome to this special discussion on India's economy. What is going on in the economy? There's an extraordinary slowdown being witnessed in several sectors, whether it's auto, passenger cars, or whether it's heavy vehicles, commercial vehicles. Air passenger traffic is at a 5-year low. Maruti has cut down production by nearly 40% in the last 4-5 months. And there is even consumer goods companies like Hindustan Lever are reporting a serious sluggishness in their sales. Now, all this is happening right after Mr. Modi has taken charge as Prime Minister for the second time, and we've had some really bad news in terms of the unemployment figures, which were there earlier denied by the government, but now admitted that unemployment is at a 45-year high. And more recently, another very shocking revelation was made by the Chief Economic Advisor to Finance Ministry until some months ago, Arun Kumar, who did a research paper to suggest that India was actually growing at just 4.5%. GDP growth was only 4.5% between 2011 and 2017, and not an average of 7%, which we were all given to understand. So we are facing a whole lot of complications in the way we collate and bring out data, which then helps us actually navigate policy. So Subramaniam has said that the speedometer of the policy automobile, as it were, he said, was broken all these years. So to discuss this and the future prospects of the economy, prospects of budget policy, we have with us Professor Arun Kumar, who's a regular at the Wire, very well-known economist who taught at JNU, written several books on black money. So, Professor Arun Kumar, please tell us, how do you view, to begin with, what Arvind Subramaniam has said about India's economy?
So, Arvind Subramaniam has said that the economy is growing at 2.5% less than what was earlier said, and this is in the period where the base change took place in 2011-12, So his data is for 2011-12 to 2016-17, which just about touches the demonetization period. And everybody was very surprised when earlier it was shown by the government that during demonetization the rate of growth was the highest at 8.2%, So there have been several controversies on the GDP, and this is the fifth controversy, so to say. Yeah. So when the new base...
Yeah, and you've written for us recording all the controversies around
that's
GDP.
Right. Yeah. So that's why Mr. Subramaniam said that, it doesn't feel like 7% rate of growth.
This is something that Raghuram Rajan also used to
say. And the economic survey 3 years back also hinted at that. We don't understand how this rate of growth is so high. So now he has come out with a paper with an alternate methodology for measuring GDP, based on regression analysis. Earlier, what we do with the GDP measurement is we go sector by sector. So there are primary, secondary and tertiary sector. These are further broken down into 9 sectors. Those are further broken down into public sector, private sector, organized sector, unorganized sector, So about 27, 30 different, sub-sectors which are measured and added up.
You also been saying that the GDP probably was growing at much less than
right. So that's a different
right?
So that's a different So the problem is that post demonetization the unorganized sector started declining. Now when there's a shock to the economy, then the earlier method that is used to estimate GDP, that doesn't hold anymore.
But this talks about pre-demonetization, right?
No, just about demonetization is touched because 2016-17 is there. But the point is that he's saying that
he says that from 2011 to 17.
Yes.
So let's say 2011 to 16.
No, 16-17 is included, the demonetization year. Okay.
No, I'm otherwise saying that even for period before demonetization, he suggests that the rate of growth was merely 4.5%.
Correct.
So
average.
I would average. So I would assume that for post demonetization, as per your assessment,
Right.
it should be even lower
Yeah.
if you take the unorganized sector into account.
Yeah. So the point I was trying to make is that the organized sector is used as a proxy for the unorganized sector. When there's a shock, that breaks down.
Yeah.
So now the government is only measuring the growth of the organized sector. And what he's doing, Subramanian, is also only the organized sector, because he's not taking the unorganized sector separately. And that is slowing down. So both the official data shows that for the last so many quarters, rate of growth has plummeted from 8.2% to 5.8%. And if you add Subramaniam, then it has plummeted further. So it's not even 5.8%. If the same 2.5% still holds, then it's down to roughly about 2.5%, right? And if you then include the unorganized sector, then it's negative rate of growth.
So tell me, if you take Subramaniam as a rough guide,
yeah,
so, and let's confine ourselves to the organized sector at the moment,
Right.
because unorganized sector is a totally different debate altogether, which you have been really trying to investigate.
Yes.
And we have not been getting data on that.
Right.
Government also is not doing any white paper or any
Yes.
sort of research on that. So the growth rate that we've seen in the first quarter of this year and second quarter,
right.
5.8%, should be lower than
That's why I said
5.8.
2.5% therefore,
it should
roughly,
be,
Yeah.
As per Subramaniam, the
Yeah.
estimate should probably be lower, right?
So it should be around 2.53%, something around that, But the
So here
point,
is the question, Professor Kumar. Isn't it serious that all these years, if growth was so much lower,
right,
we were conducting policy on the assumption that growth was 7%?
correct.
Now, isn't this shocking,
Yes.
to say the least?
So therefore, when your rate of growth is wrong, then your budget data comes out wrong, because your expenditures are dependent on growth, your revenues are dependent on growth. So if your growth figures are incorrect, then your revenues are projected incorrectly, your expenditures, and therefore your deficit turns out to be wrong. And that's why we see this year, the year that's just closed, there's a shortfall of about 80,000 crores for GST and about similar amount for the direct taxes.
Yeah.
So therefore the deficit would tend to be higher. Now when the deficit tends to be higher, you cut back expenditure. So expenditure
That's what is
essential.
happening.
Yes,
Yeah. I read somewhere the revised estimates for
Yes.
2018-19.
right.
The overall shortfall in revenue is of the order of 1% of GDP.
Right.
Nearly 1%.
Correct.
1,70,000 crores.
That's what I'm saying. 85 from GST and then roughly similar amount from direct taxes. And we've cut back expenditures. That means there's a compression in the government expenditures, which explains why demand is less. So there are two sources of demand being less. One is the unorganized sector, which is declining, and that's 94% of the employment. So if you hit 94% of the employment, then it hits demand for food, it hits demand for common items. So that is less.
Which is visible.
Which is visible.
Rural wages are stagnant.
Yes.
And rural demand is also stagnant.
Stagnant.
Which shows in Hindustan Lever's sales figures.
So
also.
now the unorganized sector demand shortfall is now reflecting in the organized sector demand shortfall also.
Okay.
So the recession that was there in the unorganized sector is now transmitting into the organized sector also. And that's why you see all these auto sales, FMCG sales, etc. declining, etc. So what we have to understand is, why is the demand shortfall there? It's not just because the organized sector is slowing down. It's primarily coming out of the unorganized sector and translating into this. Now if Subramanian is right, then the demand shortfall from the organized sector is also considerably more than what we had anticipated. And that's why this is adding up.
Yeah.
So in other words, if the government wants to change, and affect it, first it must admit that what the real rate of growth is. And what's the unemployment situation? Because if your unemployment
So
situation...
in the coming budget,
Yes.
you're suggesting on July the
5th. Yes.
the government will really have to do an internal exercise and look at
Right.
project GDP growth at a more realistic level. right?
Absolutely. If it doesn't do that, which is what it didn't do last time also, because the rate of growth...
all other indicators
all
will
other
go
indicators will go haywire. And including, for instance, your RBI policies go haywire, because RBI policies target, inflation. But they also do interest rate setting so that the rate of growth of the economy can go up. If the rate of growth is very low, then the interest rate policy that they are adopting is also incorrect. So in other words, your budget data, your RBI's data, your macro data on investment savings, they all tend to go wrong if your GDP growth rate numbers are wrong. Sure. If your unemployment figures are wrong, then the GDP figures would also tend to be wrong. So all of this story begins from the unorganized sector, goes into the organized sector, and unless we can tackle the unorganized sector problem, the organized sector problem will not get tackled. So for instance, if we cut interest rates, like the RBI has been cutting interest rates, this is the third time. But the earlier 2 times it didn't lead to a boost in the rate of growth. The rate of growth has continued to fall. So interest rate policy will not solve the problem, because that only takes care of some of the organized sector problem. But because that problem is originating from the unorganized sector, that problem doesn't get sorted out. If the government offers tax concession, which is what the industry is demanding, auto sector and others, that will also not take care of the unorganized sector's problem. And in the unorganized sector, you have the MSME, now, which is micro, small and medium. Now, small and medium are really not necessarily the unorganized sector, but it's the micro and the small.
Micro.
And
which
micro
are not registered with the Ministry of Corporate Affairs.
And micro is 99% of MSME. Okay. And it employs 97.5% of the MSME. Okay. So if you don't
overall unorganized sector is about 90%.
94% of the employment and 45% of the output, including agriculture. So unless we tackle the problem faced by the micro sector, and the NBFC crisis has again affected the small and the micro sector, because that's where they used to get their loans from, So therefore the two shocks to the economy, they have affected. The NBFC shock has further affected the unorganized sector, and that's what you're seeing play out in the economy. And that's why the farmers' crisis is also linked to the unorganized sector crisis, because when 94% begin to lose employment, the demand for food comes down, then the food prices come down, and the farmers' incomes come down.
The one thing that really strikes one as a very distinctive feature of the Modi years, NDA years, is I don't know whether you would agree with me. There's been virtually no pickup in private investment. There's been no pickup in bank credit to industry,
right?
Which is still stagnant, and banks were in a crisis because there was huge building up, NPAs building up, largely coming from big infrastructure projects, which have not been able to repay bank loans. Right, that problem still remains, and now that problem has got transferred to the NBFCs.
Right.
Only yesterday or some days ago, Pricewaterhouse, one of the biggest auditors, the biggest perhaps, wrote to the Ministry of Corporate Affairs, saying that they wanted to resign from an NBFC, a very well-known NBFC, Reliance Capital, and they're citing possible fraud, which of course Reliance has denied, and problems with the balance sheet. So we've already seen some other NBFCs going down. Right. There's a liquidity crisis. There's a solvency crisis.
That's right.
So where do you think are we headed? Do you think whatever Nirmala Sitharaman may booster she may provide in the budget, if banks and NBFCs are not repaired, do you think there will be pickup in investment?
No. So in other words, this is one additional factor why investment is low in the economy, why the private investment is not picking up. But the primary reason is, if you look at the RBI data, the capacity utilization is fairly low. Capacity utilization has to rise before industry begins to invest more. Manufacturing begins to invest more. Businesses begin to invest more. Second is, if the data credibility is low, then people will not believe the data, and they will understand why the profitability has not been rising, why capacity utilization has been rising, and foreign investors will see that, and therefore foreign investors are likely to slow down. So
establishing corporate profitability, if you take the top top 500 or 1,000, is at a 10-year low.
That's right.
10-year low.
And that is because of demand shortage. The ability to sell your products, if that is low, then your capacity utilization is low, and therefore profitability comes down. So in other words, first government must be transparent about data. It must admit what it is and then apply correctives. If the government denies the problem, then it doesn't have to do anything. If your rate of growth is 7%, it's the best in the world, then you don't need to take drastic steps.
We've been hearing this government boasts, at least I've heard it 100 times, that we are the fastest growing, we've crossed China, but if you see the last 2 quarters, probably we are much lower than China.
We are lower than China, and if you then apply the Subramanian correction to it, then we are even lower.
Much lower.
Now, the government keeps saying that the IMF is supporting our data, the World Bank is supporting, but we must recognize that IMF, World Bank, ADB are not independent data collecting agencies. They simply take the data from the government and use that in their own analysis. They only
tweak back to us.
They only tweak it a little bit. So therefore, IMF or even the RBI saying that this is the rate of growth doesn't mean it's an independent collection agency. They're only supporting what the government is saying because they're not doing independent analysis. Now Subramanian has come out with some kind of independent analysis. I had been giving this different kind of analysis for the last 3 years, where the rate of growth I've shown is less than 1% rather than 7%. And that is where the government in the budget, otherwise the budgetary figures will go wrong like they went wrong last year. Okay, and they'll not be able to achieve policy what they want to achieve.
Yeah.
Yes. So therefore, the government must now focus on this: how to generate employment, mass employment, and for that I suggest education, health. These are employment generating.
I want to come to this point.
Yeah.
Arun, it's true that most economists say that the regular industries which the middle class, whose products middle class consumes, whether it's two-wheeler, passenger cars, or whether it's consumer durables, ACs, refrigerators. Now, all these are working. They are working at way below capacity.
Right.
At about 75%.
That's what the RBI data shows.
Yeah. So obviously there won't be any investment from these industries because they would obviously wait to see full capacity utilization. Demand picks up, and there is a unless the capacity utilization of the factories go beyond 90%, they won't look at fresh investment. Now, some economists, government economists, who believe, and I believe there is a paper NIPFP has given to the Prime Minister's office, not now, earlier, Rathin Roy, who is the director of NIPFP. He comes up with an interesting idea. He says that now the government should focus on sectors where demand exceeds supply by a big margin, where there is supply constraint. And according to him, these sectors could be very low cost housing, housing under say 10-12 lakh rupees, one room for the poor. It is possible that there is no supply here and there is a lot of demand. It's possible that healthcare, a lot of government hospitals do not have adequate supplies to even meet the requirements of the Ayushman Bharat. Right. So if there could be a public-private partnership where private sector can be brought in to fill the supply gaps.
Right.
And higher education,
Yes.
In such like industries. Do you think it makes sense to focus on these sectors?
No. So, what is the meaning of focusing on these sectors? The idea is to
bring
invest,
more investment,
right? And that's why I started saying that where would we generate employment? And especially of the middle class. And the latest data shows that unemployment is very high amongst the educated. The more educated you are, the more the unemployment you are facing. That's what the latest data shows. So, if you build investment into education, into health, these will generate employment. Then into rural areas. Construction by itself is not largely employment generating because that's also very heavily mechanized. Agriculture is getting mechanized. So even if you invest in agriculture, that by itself is not going to generate a lot more because that's going to go into tractors and harvester combines and so on and so forth. So we have to identify areas, and these are areas like rural electrification, rural infrastructure creation like roads and telecommunication, then education and health, rural small irrigation, etc. These will generate a lot of jobs. These people will then increase demand, and when they increase demand, then farmers' lot will improve, and when the farmers' lot improves, then the demand for other goods will rise, unemployment situation will. So all the crisis that is being faced today, which originates from the unorganized sector, that's of employment, that's of farmers' crisis, they will be resolved. So we have to focus on these sectors. If you cut taxes only for the organized sector, that will not solve the problem. If you just lower interest rates,
then you're focusing on the wrong
on the wrong end. So my argument for the last 2 years has been that we need to focus on the unorganized sector, the micro sector, and generate the infrastructure around it so that it becomes more viable. And the GST has to be simplified. The GST has created a lot of.
You written a book on GST, and you have argued that the GST needs to be simplified way more than it is today, right?
It has to be completely revamped, so it is a last point tax rather than at each of the stages, okay, and that will simplify it enormously.
And you also talked about increasing the threshold.
Yes,
much more than it is today, right?
Not too much more, but the point is that there is a structural flaw today. That structural flaw will go away if you make it a last point tax or the final stage rather than all the intermediate stages.
That of course will be taken care of by the GST Council, right?
Yes. But it's a proposal, which I have discussed.
So do you think this budget, Nirmala Sitharaman should one point that comes across from our conversation is that they should focus their investments, both private and public investments, in areas where which are linked to the micro
and the
unorganized
yes,
sector.
unorganized
Right?
sector.
Yeah,
Correct.
okay.
Yeah.
So, any other area where you think a fiscal stimulus might be required?
So a fiscal stimulus would, you can do this financing in two ways. Either you begin to tax wealth and your estate duty and
is
gift
it
tax.
time to tax inheritance?
Inheritance,
wealth?
so that's estate duty.
Yeah.
So as the data from Oxfam shows that 9 people have more wealth than 700 million people have. So there's a lot of wealth disparity, and you can tap only 0.5% tax on wealth. That'll give you another 2-3 lakh crores, which can be used.
Because financing is a big issue.
Yes, financing is an issue.
Again, this government claims that it is meeting its fiscal deficit target of 3.4, but actually
But
it is
by
not.
cutting expenditures.
And no, besides that, Arun, there are a lot of accounting fudges which are happening.
Yes.
For
yes.
instance, they've taken a lot of GST balance,
Yes.
which are owed to exporters and the state's share
Yes,
of IGST.
yes.
I'm told nearly 1 lakh crore, which they've taken into the consolidated fund.
That's right.
Which is actually
Yeah.
a liability, which
Yes.
is to be paid immediately.
Correct.
And
So this has been going on.
And
where-
borrowings by Food Corporation of India, I'm told, to the extent of
2 lakh crores.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's also
So burden on the public sector, in other words, is
Yeah,
being put.
yeah.
So
So-
all this called IEBR, internal extra budgetary resources, they have
So do you
tapped
think
on
the
that.
government, how will it raise resources? Do you think it needs to disinvest PSUs
No.
more than they're doing now?
Well, disinvestment is only taking capital from one to the other. That's not a fresh resource. That's not a fresh capital investment. Okay. So in other words, disinvestment by itself should not be taken as the way to cut fiscal deficit. To cut fiscal deficit, you can do two things: either cut expenditures. If you cut expenditure, demand problem will be increased further. So you have to raise resources like wealth tax, etc., and then use that to.
How much fiscal deficit do you think India can tolerate?
Okay. So
Now,
that's
do we need to follow the IMF, World Bank,
Yeah,
and the
yeah.
Western wisdom? To see
Right,
that it should be
right,
3%
yeah.
or 2.5%.
So I was coming to that.
A growing way below employment
Right.
country like India.
So if
economy
we
like
can't
India.
raise enough resources, then can we raise fiscal deficit by 1 percentage point? Given that capacity underutilization is there, given that food stocks are high, that will not cause inflation. So I mean, there's nothing God-given or written in stone. There has to be 3.4% or 3%.
We can go up to 4.5%.
Yeah, we can go up to that without creating problem of inflation at this point of time, and that will get us enough resources to invest in employment generation. And once that begins to take place, then your tax collection will rise, and then the fiscal deficit will come down automatically.
Okay, so that takes care of resources.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Professor Arun Kumar, for talking to us.
Thanks.
And giving us some insights. Thanks for watching.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.